All right, so this one is a bit of a treat, or at least I really enjoy doing these. So I have been going through some of the books that I really liked in my childhood, that I found inspiring in some way. Puppy just came through. But so This is one which I often would think about later on as I was growing up, and particularly various times in puberty, here and there, just kind of thinking about stuff. Uh, Not surprisingly, when I found out about it later on, it turned out to be one that was is considered to be sort of a precursor, proto transgender story, and I always sort of enjoyed it. So let's talk about it. The name of the story that I'll be reading is The Story of X. Now, what this is in fact the original short story, which the children's book that I really liked, was based upon. The children's book, goes by the name of X, A Fabulous Child's Story, as you can see there. And I mean, okay, I don't exactly know if fabulous meant what it did back in the 1970s was it what it does today. But regardless, yes, X is absolutely a fabulous child, and I think that calling X a fabulous child is absolutely appropriate. But so let's talk about X. X is written by this woman here, as you can, right, there we go. Okay, and her name is Lois Gold. So I'm just gonna do a little bit of introduction. So originally, this story was published in Ms. Magazine. Those who don't know, Ms. Magazine was a very prominent feminist magazine published by Gloria Steinem. So this was published in 1972. So then it was kind of made its way around for about 6 years, then republished as a children's picture book in 1978. Yeah. So now the book tells the story of X. Now it's a child who's raised as part of an experiment. It's a little bit kind of weird because the parents are sort of scientists, whatever. But the thing is that it is one where it's kind of necessary to have the parents who are going to be thinking about things in a certain way and going to be willing to raise the child a certain way. So now there's been a few things. There was an actual experiment that was done that was vaguely based upon this in 1975. There are various adaptations are run into. There is a short film adaptation that is kicking around there that I believe was released in 2016. So yeah, it actually is pretty good. I believe the short film was known as Baby X. And if it's on YouTube, I'm going to put a link in the description so you guys can find it on YouTube. All right, so before I actually continue, though, I actually want to just talk briefly about Lois Gold. All right, I'm going to take my picture away, and I'm going to show you the quote that came along with this image. My favorite question that's asked only of women is, what do you do with yourself all day? The only possible answer is, make nuclear bombs in my bathrooms. Just little ones, though. I love that because, I mean, right. Oh, I'm making nuclear bombs in the bathroom, but I'm a woman, so don't worry, they're just little ones. I don't know, I like that. So, and that's the kind of thing that I think we can sort of expect from Lois. She's I really do appreciate a lot of her work, as you might imagine. I mean, it had an effect on me as a child, and I am reading this to you now. All right, so I'm getting this all set up. Okay. Now, let's begin with our story. Once upon a time, a baby named X was born. It was named X so nobody could tell whether it was a boy or a girl. Its parents could tell, of course, but they couldn't tell anyone else. They couldn't even tell baby X, at least not until much, much later. You see, X was part of a very important secret scientific experiment officially known as Project Baby X. There's a few little things in here where the experiment begins with X and various other words begin with X. It's fun. So this experiment was going to cost exactly $23 billion and 72 cents, which might seem a lot for one baby, but even if it was an important baby. But you must remember the cost of strained carrots, stuffed bunnies, booster shots, 20 shiny quarters from the Tooth Fairy, and you begin to see how it adds up. Long before baby X was born, the smartest scientists had to work out the secret details of the experiment to write the official instruction manual in secret code for baby X's parents, whoever they were. These parents had to be selected very carefully. Thousands of people volunteered to take thousands of tests with thousands of tricky questions. Almost everybody failed it because it turned out almost everybody had wanted a boy or a girl and not a baby X at all. Almost everybody thought a baby X would be more trouble than a boy or a girl. They were right, too. There were families with grandparents named Milton and Agatha who wanted the baby named Milton or Agatha instead of X, even if it was an X. There were aunts who wanted to knit tiny dresses and uncles who wanted to send tiny baseball mitts. Worst of all, there were families with other children who just couldn't keep a secret. Not if they knew the secret was worth $23 billion and 72 cents, and all you had to do was take one little peek at baby X in the bathtub to know what it was. Finally, the scientists found the Joneses, who really wanted to raise an X more than any other kind of baby, no matter how much trouble it was. The Joneses promised to take turns holding X, feeding X, and singing X to sleep. And they promised to never hire any babysitters. The scientists knew that a babysitter would probably peek at X in the bathtub, too. The day the Joneses brought their baby home, lots of friends and relatives came to see it. At first, the thing they asked, well, what kind of baby X was? And when the Jones said, "It's an X," nobody knew what to say. They couldn't say, "Oh, look at her cute little dimples." On the other hand, they couldn't say, "Look at his husky little biceps." And they didn't feel right just plain saying, "Coochie coo." The relatives all felt embarrassed about having an X in the family. "People will think there's something wrong with it," they whispered. "Nonsense," the Jones said stoutly. What could possibly be wrong with this perfectly adorable X? Clearly, nothing was wrong at all. Nevertheless, the cousins who had sent a tiny football helmet could not come and visit anymore, and the neighbors who sent a pink-flowered romper suit pulled their shades down when the Joneses passed their house. The official instruction manual had warned them, the new parents, that this would happen, so they didn't fret about it. Besides, they were too busy learning how to bring up baby X. Mr. and Mrs. Jones had to be extra careful. If they kept bouncing up in the air and saying how strong and active it was, they'd be treating it more like a boy than an X. But if all they did was cuddle and kiss it and tell it how sweet and dainty it was, they'd be treating it more like a girl than an X. On page 1654 of the official instruction manual, the scientists prescribed plenty of bouncing and plenty of cuddling. Both. X ought to be strong and sweet and active. Forget about dainty altogether. There were other problems too. Toys, for example, and clothes. On his first shopping trip, Mr. Jones told the store clerk, "I need some things for a new baby." The clerk smiled and says, "Well, is it a boy or a girl?" "It's an X," Mr. Jones said, smiling back. But the clerk got all red in the face and said huffily, "Well, in that case, I'm afraid I can't help you, sir." Mr. Jones wandered the aisles looking, trying to find what X needed, but everything was in sections marked boys or girls. Boys' pajamas and girls' underwear and boys' fire engines and girls' housekeeping sets. Mr. Jones went home without buying anything for X. That night, he and Jones consulted page 2326 of the official instruction manual. It said firmly, buy plenty of everything. So they bought all kinds of toys. A boy that made pee-pee and cried papa, a little girl that talked in 3 languages and said, "I am the president of General Motors." They brought a storybook about a brave princess who regularly rescued a handsome prince from his tower, another about a sister and a brother who grew up to be a baseball star and a ballet star, and you had to guess which. The head scientists of Project Baby X checked all their purchases and told them to keep up the good work. They reminded the Joneses where to see pages 4629 of the manual, where it said, "Never make Baby X embarrassed, ashamed about wanting to play with what it wants to play with." Never say, nice little X's don't get dirty climbing rocks. Likewise, as said, if X cries down and falls, never say, brave X's don't cry, because of course, nice little X's do get dirty, and brave little X's do cry. Because no matter how dirty X gets, or no matter how hard it cries, don't worry. It's all part of the experiment. When the Jones pushed baby X's stroller into the park, smiling strangers would come over and coo, is that a boy or a girl? The Joneses would smile back and say, it's an X. The strangers would then stop smiling and often snarl something nasty, as if the Joneses had said something nasty to them. Once a little girl grabbed X's shovel in the sandbox and zonked X on the head with it. Now, Tracy, the mother said, little girls mustn't hit little... And she turned to X and asked, are you a little boy or a little girl, dear? Mr. Jones, who was sitting near the handbox, held his breath and crossed his fingers. X smiled politely, even though X's head had never been zonked so hard in its life. I'm a little X, said X. You're a what? The lady screamed anxiously. You're a little B-R-A-T, you mean. But little girls mustn't hit X's either, said X, retrieving the shovel with another polite smile. What's good hitting anyway? X's father finally exhaled, uncrossed his fingers, and grinned. At their next secret Project Baby X meeting, the scientist grinned too. Baby X was doing fine. But then it was time for X to start school. Uh-oh. It's school. Yeah, that's never fun for anybody. Okay, so. The Joneses were really worried about this because school was even more full of rules for boys and rules for girls, and there were no rules for X's. Teachers would tell boys to form a line and girls to form another line. There would be boys' games and girls' games and boys' secrets and girls' secrets. The school library would have a list of recommended books for girls and a different list for boys. There would be even a bathroom marked boys and one marked girls. Pretty soon, boys and girls would hardly even talk to each other. What would happen to poor little X? The Joneses spent weeks consulting their instruction manual. There are 249 pages of advice under first day of school. Then they were all summoned to an urgent extra special conference with the smart scientists of Project Baby X. The science had to make sure that X's mother had taught X how to throw and catch a ball properly, and that X's father had been sure how to teach X what to serve at a doll's tea party. X had to know how to shoot marbles and jump rope, and most of all, what to say when the other children asked whether X was a boy or a girl. Finally, X was ready. X's teacher had promised that the class could line up alphabetically instead of forming separate lines for boys and girls, and X had permission to use the principal's bathroom because it wasn't marked anything except bathroom. But nobody could help X with the biggest problem of all: other children. Nobody in X's class had ever known an X. Nobody ever heard grown-ups say, some of my best friends are X's. What would the other children think? Would they make Xist jokes? Or would they make friends? You couldn't tell what X was by its clothes. Overalls don't even button right to left like girls' clothes, or left to right like boys' clothes. And did X have a short girl's haircut or a boy's long haircut? As for the games X liked, either X played ball very well for a girl, or else played house very well for a boy. Children tried finding out what X was by asking tricky questions like, who's your favorite sports star? X had two favorite sports stars, a girl jockey named Robin Smith and a boy archery champion named Robin Hood. Then they asked, what's your favorite TV show? And X said, Lassie, which stars a girl played by a boy dog. And when X said his favorite toy was a doll, then everyone decided that X must be a girl. Then when X said the doll was really a robot and that X had computerized it and programmed it to bake fudge and clean up the kitchen. After X told them that, they gave up guessing what X was. All they knew was they'd like to see X's doll. After school, X wanted to play with the other children. How about shooting baskets in the gym? X asked the girls. But all they wanted to do was make faces and giggle behind X's back. Boy, is he weird, whispered Wim to Joe. How about weaving some baskets in the arts and crafts room? X asked the boys. But they all made faces and giggled behind X's back too. Boy, is she weird, whispered Susie to Peggy. That night, Ms. Jones and Mr. Jones asked X how things had gone at school. X tried to smile, but there were two big tears in its eyes. "The lessons are okay," X began. But, said Mrs. Jones. "The other children hate me," X whispered. "Hate you," said Mr. Jones. X nodded, which made the two big tears roll and splash down on its overalls. Once more the Joneses reached for their instruction manual. Under other children, it said, "What did you expect? Other children have to obey silly boy-girl rules because their parents taught them to. Lucky X. You'd have rules at all. All you have to do is be yourself. P.S. We're not saying it's going to be easy." X liked being itself, but X cried a lot that night. So X's father held X tight and cried a little too. X's mother cheered them up with an exciting story about an enchanted prince called Sleeping Handsome who woke up when Princess Charming kissed him. The next morning they all felt much better, and little X went back to school with a brave smile and a clean pair of red and white checkered overalls. There was a 7-letter word spelling bee in class today, and a 7-lap boys relay race in the gym, and a 7-layer cake baking contest in the girls' kitchen corner. X won the spelling bee, X also won the relay race, and X almost won the baking contest, except it forgot to light the oven. Remember, nobody's perfect. One of the other children noticed something else too. He said, "X doesn't care about winning. X just thinks it's fun playing boy stuff and girl stuff." "Come to think of it," said one of the other children, "X is having twice as much fun as we are." After school that day, the girl who beat X in the baking contest gave X a big slice of her winning cake, and the boy X beat in the relay race asked X to race him home. From then on, some really fun things began to happen. Susie, who sat next to X, refused to wear pink dresses to school anymore. She wanted red and white checked overalls, just like X's. Overalls, she told her parents, were better for climbing monkey bars. Then Jim, the class football nut, started wheeling his little sister's doll carriage around the football field. He'd put on his entire football uniform except for the helmet. Then put the helmet in the carriage, lovingly tucked under an old set of shoulder pads. Then he'd jog around the field pushing the carriage and sing "Rock-a-bye Baby" to his helmet. And he said X did the same thing, so it must be okay. After all, X was the team's star quarterback. Susie's parents were horrified by her behavior, and Jim's parents were worried sick about this. The worst came when the twins, Joe and Peggy, decided to share everything with each other. Peggy used Joe's hockey skates and his microscope and took half his newspaper route. Joe used Peggy's needlepoint kit and her cookbooks and took 2 of her 3 babysitting jobs. Peggy ran the lawnmower, Joe ran the vacuum cleaner. Their parents were one bit pleased with Peggy's science experiments or with Joe's terrific needlepoint pillows. They didn't care that Peggy mowed the lawn better or that Joe vacuumed the carpet better. In fact, they were furious. It's all little X's fault, they agreed. X doesn't know what it is or what it's supposed to be, so X wants to mix everybody else up too. Peggy and Joe were forbidden to play with X anymore. So was Susie, and then Jim, and then all the other children. But it was too late. The other children stayed and mixed up and happy and free and refused to go back to the way they'd been before meeting X. Finally, the parents had an emergency meeting to discuss the X problem. They sent a report to the principal stating that X was a bad influence, demanding immediate action. The Joneses, they said, should be forced to tell whether X was a boy or a girl, and X should be forced to behave like whichever it was. And if the Joneses refused to tell, the parents said, then X must take an examination. An impartial team of experts would extract the secret. Then X would start obeying all the old rules, or else. And if X turned out to be some kind of mixed-up misfit, then X must be expelled from school immediately. So no little X's would ever come to school again. The principal was very upset. Was X a bad influence, a mixed-up misfit? But X was an excellent student. X set a fine example. X was extraordinary. X was president of the student council. X had won first prize in the art show, honorable mention in the science fair, and 6 events on field day, including the potato sack race. Nevertheless, insisted the parents, X is a problem child. X is the biggest problem child we ever had. So the principal reluctantly notified X's parents, and then Jones reported this to the Project X scientists, who referred them to page 85,769 of the instruction manual. Sooner or later, it said, X will have to be examined by an impartial team of experts. This is the only way for any of us to know whether X is mixed up or everyone else is. At exactly 9 o'clock the next day, X reported to the school health office. The principal, along with a committee from the Parents Association, X's teacher, X's classmate, and Mr. and Mrs. Jones waited in the hall outside. Inside, the experts had set up their famous testing machine, the super psychobiometer. Nobody knew exactly how the machine worked, but everybody knew that the examination would reveal exactly what everyone wanted to know about X, but were afraid to ask. It was terribly quiet in the hall, almost spooky. They could hear very strange noises from the room, and there were buzzes, and a beep or two, and several bells, and an occasional light flashed under the door. Was it an X-ray? Through it all, you could hear the expert voices asking questions, and X's voice answering answers. I wouldn't like to be in X's overalls right now, the children thought. At last, the door opened. Everyone crowded around to hear the results. X didn't look any different. In fact, X was smiling. But the impartial team of experts looked terrible. They looked as if they were crying. What happened? Everyone began shouting. Shh, shushed the principal. The experts are trying to speak. Wiping his eyes and clearing his throat, one expert began. In our opinion, he whispered. You could tell he must be very upset. In our opinion, young X here. Yes, yes, shouted parents. Young X, said the other expert frowning, is just about the least mixed up child we've ever examined. Exclaimed the two parents experts together. Behind the closed door, the super psycho media society meter made a noise like a contented hum. Yay for X, yelled one of the children, and the other children began yelling too, clapping and cheering and jumping up and down. Shh, the principal, but nobody did. The parents' committee was angry and bewildered. How could have X passed the whole examination? Didn't X have an identity problem? Well, wasn't X, turns out. X wasn't messed up at all. X wasn't any kind of a misfit. How could it be when it didn't even know what it was? Don't you see, asked the expert. X isn't one bit mixed up. As for being a misfit, ridiculous. X knows perfectly well what it is. Don't you, X? The experts winked. X winked back. But what is X? Shrieked Peggy's and Joe's parents. We still want to know what it is. Ah, yes, said the experts, winking again. Well, don't worry. You'll all know one of these days, and you won't need us to tell you. What do they mean? Jim's parents grumbled suspiciously. Susie and Peggy and Joe all answered at once. They mean that by the time it matters what sex X is, it won't be a secret anymore. With that, the experts reached out to hug Mr. and Ms. Jones. If we ever have an X of one of our own, they whispered, we sure hope you'll lend us your instruction manual. Needless to say, the Joneses were very happy. The Project Baby X scientists were rather pleased too. So were Susie, Jim, Peggy, Joe, and all the other children. Even the parents promised not to make any trouble. Later that day, all X's friends put on their red and white checkered overalls and went over to see X. They found X in the backyard, playing with a very tiny baby that none of them had ever seen before. The baby was wearing very tiny red and white checked overalls. How do you like our new baby? X asked the other children proudly. It's got cute dimples, said Jim. It's got husky biceps too, said Susie. What kind of baby is it? Asked Joe and Peggy. X frowned at them. Can't you tell? And then X broke into a big, mischievous grin. It's a Y! So that is not quite the story that I remember from my childhood, but it's one that I think is a little more appropriate for adults. It does, as you can see, it is by no means a perfect transgender story or affirmation. It's a little horrifying at times, right? I mean, the manual says that eventually, X must submit to an examination by experts. Wow, that's rough. Whew, I don't think I would be okay with my particular X being examined by a team of experts. And of course, that by the time it matters, what gender X is, that we'll know already. So there's not really. I think there's a certain amount of just talking about it strictly in. I don't think it's understood quite so much that gender is a construct in that one as much as it could be, at least for adults. It's understood that it's, definitely a construct for children. I mean, what does it matter for children? And this is really one of the things that I think I found really wholesome about it is that, when you're a child, it really doesn't. Play is play, creativity is creativity, learning is learning. However you do it, that's the important part. So, yeah, just remember, maybe we can take a few lessons. We don't have to ask adults to take examinations, gender examinations. We don't have to expect, when the day comes that it matters what gender a person is, that they'll tell us or that it'll come out. Maybe they just want to be an X for their entire life. And I think that we're finally living in a world where that is seen properly as valid, and I'm glad. So that is X, or The Story of X by Lois Gold. I hope that it may have some of the same impact on you that it did on me. So take care.